The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in Courtroom 3B, casting harsh shadows across the wooden benches filled with worried families and tired lawyers. 20-year-old Devin sat slumped in the defendant's chair, his worn sneakers barely touching the floor. His hands were cuffed behind his back, and every few seconds he would glance toward the gallery where his mother, Patricia, sat with her purse clutched tightly in her lap. Patricia looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Her usually perfect blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and dark circles ringed her eyes. She wore her best business suit, the navy blue one she saved for important meetings, but even that couldn't hide how defeated she looked. This wasn't her first time in a courtroom because of Devin, and the weight of that reality pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. Devin's attorney, a young public defender named Mike Rodriguez, shuffled through a stack of papers that seemed to grow thicker every time he opened the folder. He had 17 other cases that week, and Devin's file was just one more sad story in an endless pile of broken families and poor choices. Mike had been doing this job for 3 years, and he could already see how this case would end. The kid would get probation, maybe some community service, and then he'd be back in 6 months with something worse. Judge Helen Carter presided over the courtroom with the kind of quiet authority that comes from seeing everything twice. She was a black woman in her 50s who had worked her way up from being a prosecutor to sitting on the bench for the past 12 years. Her reputation was solid, tough but fair, with a particular soft spot for young people who seemed to have lost their way. But even she had limits, and repeat offenders tested her patience. The charges against Devin weren't the worst she'd seen that week. Vandalism at a local grocery store, petty theft of about $40 worth of items, and disturbing the peace. But what made Judge Carter pause was Devin's history. This was his 4th time in her courtroom in 18 months. Each offense was a little worse than the last, like watching someone slide down a hill and pick up speed with every tumble. Devin's troubles had started 3 years earlier when his father died in a car accident. Patricia remembered the exact moment her son changed. They were at the funeral, and Devin stood at the graveside with tears streaming down his face, but his eyes looked angry instead of sad. That anger never really went away. It just found different ways to come out. At first, it was small things. Devin would skip school, and Patricia would get calls from the attendance office. Then his grades started falling. The boy who used to get A's and B's was suddenly bringing home report cards with D's and F's. Patricia tried everything she could think of. She took away his phone, his video games, his car privileges. She grounded him for weeks at a time. She even tried bribing him with promises of new clothes or concert tickets if he would just try harder in school. Nothing worked. Devin seemed determined to push away everyone who cared about him. He would stay out all night and come home smelling like cigarettes and cheap beer. Patricia would lie awake listening for the sound of his key in the front door, praying he would make it home safely, but dreading the fight that would inevitably follow. The first time Devin got arrested, Patricia thought it might be a wake-up call. He had been caught shoplifting at a department store, just a cheap watch that cost $15. The security guard said Devin didn't even try to run when he was caught. He just stood there and let them call the police. Patricia hired a lawyer, and Devin got off with community service and a stern warning from the judge. But instead of learning his lesson, Devin seemed to take the arrest as proof that nothing really mattered anymore. He started hanging around with kids Patricia didn't recognize, kids who looked at adults like they were the enemy. These new friends had tattoos and piercings and attitudes that made Patricia nervous when they came to pick up Devin in cars with loud music and tinted windows. Patricia tried talking to Devin about his father's death. She suggested counseling, support groups, anything that might help him process his grief in a healthier way. But Devin would just shrug and walk away, leaving Patricia feeling more helpless than ever. She started going to her own therapy sessions, desperate to understand how to reach her son before he completely destroyed his future. The second arrest came 6 months later. Devin and his friends had been caught spray painting graffiti on the side of an abandoned building. This time, the judge was less understanding. Devin got 30 days of community service and had to pay for the cleanup costs. Patricia watched, Her son pick up trash along the highway for a month, hoping the embarrassment might sink in. But Devin just seemed to get more bitter with each passing day. By the time of his third arrest, Patricia had almost given up hope. Devin had been caught, trying to steal a car stereo, and this time he was clearly under the influence of something stronger than beer. The judge ordered him into a drug treatment program, but Devin attended just enough sessions to avoid jail time and then stopped going altogether. Now, sitting in this courtroom for the fourth time, Patricia felt like she was watching her son disappear completely. The boy who used to help her in the garden and make her laugh with silly jokes had been replaced by this angry young man who looked at her like she was a stranger. She had spent countless nights crying into her pillow, wondering what she had done wrong and how she could have prevented this downward spiral. Devin, for his part, felt trapped in a life that no longer made sense. After his father died, nothing seemed to matter anymore. His dad had been his hero, the person who taught him how to throw a baseball and fix a bicycle chain. They used to spend Saturday afternoons working on old cars in the garage, and his father would tell him stories about his own childhood and share advice about becoming a man. Without that guiding voice, Devin felt lost and angry. He was angry at God for taking his father away. He was angry at his mother for trying to fill a role she couldn't possibly fill. He was angry at his friends for having fathers who were still alive. Most of all, he was angry at himself for not being able to handle his pain in a way that didn't hurt everyone around him. The stealing and vandalism weren't really about money or rebellion. They were about feeling something other than the empty sadness that had taken up residence in his chest. When he was running from security guards or spray painting walls, his heart would race and his mind would focus on something other than the fact that his father was never coming home. It was the only time he felt alive anymore. As Judge Carter called Devin's case to order, the courtroom fell silent except for the soft sound of Patricia crying quietly in the back row. Devin didn't turn around to look at her. He couldn't bear to see the disappointment in her eyes one more time. Instead, he stared straight ahead and waited for whatever punishment was coming next, wondering if anything could possibly make him feel like himself again. The heavy courtroom doors creaked open just as Judge Carter was about to begin the proceedings. Everyone turned to see who was entering so late, and a woman in her mid-50s stepped quietly into the room. She wore a simple navy dress and carried herself with the kind of dignity that comes from years of helping others through their worst moments. Her name was Grace Williams, and she had been working as a community social worker for over 20 years. Grace scanned the courtroom until her eyes found Devin sitting at the defendant's table. Her heart ached seeing him there, looking so small and defeated. She had been hoping this day would never come, but deep down, she knew it was inevitable. The path Devin had been walking was leading straight to this moment, and all she could do now was try to help him find a different direction. 8 months earlier, Grace had been doing her usual evening rounds through the rougher parts of town. It was something she did on her own time, not because the city paid her for it, but because she couldn't sleep at night knowing there were young people out there with nowhere safe to go. She carried a backpack filled with sandwiches, bottles of water, and information about local shelters and programs. That particular night in October, the air was getting cold, and Grace knew the homeless population would be looking for warm places to sleep. She had just finished talking to an elderly man who lived under a bridge when she heard voices coming from an abandoned warehouse about 2 blocks away. The building had been empty for years, and Grace knew it was dangerous. Broken glass everywhere, holes in the floor and no electricity or heat. As she got closer, she could hear someone crying. Not the kind of crying that comes from physical pain, but the deep, soul-crushing sobs of someone who had given up hope. Grace had heard that sound too many times in her career, and it never got easier to listen to. She carefully made her way through the broken fence and toward the sound. Inside the warehouse, she found Devin huddled in a corner with a thin blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He was shivering from the cold, and his face was streaked with ears. When he saw Grace approaching, he tried to wipe his eyes and act tough, but she could see right through the act. This was just a scared kid who had nowhere else to go. Instead of lecturing him about the dangers of sleeping in abandoned buildings or threatening to call the police, Grace sat down on a piece of broken concrete about 10 feet away from Devin. She pulled a thermos of hot soup from her backpack and poured some into a cup, then set it on the ground between them. The smell of chicken noodle soup filled the dusty air. For the first hour, they didn't talk much. Devin was suspicious of this stranger who claimed she just wanted to help. In his experience, adults always wanted something in return, and he had learned not to trust anyone who seemed too nice. But Grace was patient. She had worked with hundreds of troubled teens over the years, and she knew that trust had to be earned slowly. Finally, Devin's hunger got the better of his suspicion. He reached for the cup of soup and drank it down quickly as if he hadn't eaten in days. Grace refilled the cup without saying a word, and Devin drank that one too. Only then did he start to talk. He told Grace about his father's death and how everything had fallen apart after that. He talked about feeling angry all the time and not knowing how to make the anger stop. He explained how his mother tried to help but just made everything worse by treating him like he was broken. Most importantly, he admitted that he was scared of becoming someone his father would be ashamed of but unable to figure out how to change direction. Grace listened without judgment. She didn't try to fix Devin's problems or offer easy solutions. She just let him talk until he had no more words left. Then she gave him her business card and told him she would be back the next evening if he wanted to talk more. She left him, with more food, a warmer blanket, and something he hadn't felt in months: hope. True to her word, Grace returned the next night. And the night after that. Slowly, Devin began to trust her. He learned that Grace had grown up in foster care and understood what it felt like to be abandoned and angry. She had made plenty of mistakes as a young person, including some run-ins with the law that could have destroyed her future. But she had been lucky enough to meet people who believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. Over the weeks that followed, Grace helped Devin find small jobs around the neighborhood. Nothing fancy: cleaning gutters, raking leaves, helping elderly people carry groceries. But the work gave Devin a sense of purpose and put a little money in his pocket. More importantly, it connected him with people who saw him as helpful rather than dangerous. Grace also convinced Devin to start working toward his high school equivalency diploma. She found a program that met in the evenings and even helped him pay the registration fee. Devin was reluctant at first, convinced he was too far behind to catch up. But Grace reminded him that his father would want him to finish his education, and that was enough motivation to get him started. The changes in Devin weren't dramatic or immediate. He still had bad days when the anger would bubble up and he would want to break something or run away. But Grace taught him better ways to handle those feelings. They would take long walks through the city, and she would let him vent about whatever was bothering him. Sometimes they would go to the gym and Devin would pound on a punching bag until he was exhausted. Other times, Grace would take him to volunteer at a soup kitchen where helping people who had even less than he did put his own problems in perspective. Patricia had no idea that any of this was happening. Devin still came home most nights, and he had gotten better at hiding his activities from his mother. He didn't want her to know about Grace because he was afraid Patricia would somehow ruin this one good thing in his life. In Devin's mind, his mother represented all the expectations and disappointments of his old life, while Grace represented the possibility of something better. But even with Grace's help, Devin couldn't completely escape the consequences of his earlier mistakes. The friends he had been running with didn't understand his sudden interest in work and school. They pressured him to participate in bigger and more dangerous schemes. When Devin started saying no, they accused him of thinking he was better than them. The pressure from his old crowd, combined with his ongoing grief and the normal struggles of trying to change ingrained habits, proved to be too much. 3 weeks before his court date, Devin had a particularly bad day. He failed an important test in his equivalency program, got into a fight with one of his former friends, and came home to find his mother going through his room looking for evidence of drug use. Feeling cornered and misunderstood, Devin made the impulsive decision that landed him back in legal trouble. He vandalized a grocery store and stole some items, almost as if he was testing whether Grace would abandon him like everyone else seemed to do when he messed up. Now, sitting in that courtroom, Grace felt the weight of her own failure. She had worked so hard to help Devin find a better path, and here he was facing criminal charges anyway. But she also knew that this moment could be a turning point. Sometimes people had to hit rock bottom before they were ready to accept real help. Grace approached the bailiff and quietly asked if she could address the court. She had never done anything like this before. But she couldn't sit silently while Devon faced these charges alone. She had documentation of all the progress he had made, his job evaluations, his school enrollment, testimonials from people he had helped in the community. More importantly, she had seen the real Devon, the young man who was still buried underneath all that pain and anger. The bailiff looked uncertain, but Grace's calm confidence convinced him to ask Judge Carter if she would allow this unusual request. The judge, intrigued by this development, nodded her approval. Grace stood up, her heart pounding, and began to walk toward the front of the courtroom, knowing that what she said next could change Devon's life forever. Grace walked slowly toward the front of the courtroom, her footsteps echoing in the tense silence. Every eye in the room followed her movement, including Devon's. For the first time since entering the courthouse, he sat up straight in his chair. He couldn't believe Grace was actually here. In all the months they had spent together, she had never mentioned knowing about his court date. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, her curiosity clearly piqued by this unexpected development. In her 12 years on the bench, she had seen family members, teachers, and employers speak on behalf of defendants. But something about this woman seemed different. There was a quiet strength in the way Grace carried herself, and the judge could sense that whatever she was about to hear would be important. Patricia, still sitting in the gallery, watched this unfamiliar woman with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Who was this person? And how did she know Devon? Patricia thought she knew everything about her son's life, but clearly, there were things happening that she had no idea about. A small part of her felt hurt that Devon had apparently confided in a stranger while shutting her out completely. Grace reached the area in front of the judge's bench and cleared her throat softly. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was steady when she began to speak. She had practiced what she wanted to say during the drive to the courthouse, but now that the moment was here, she decided to speak from her heart instead of following any script. "Your Honor," Grace began, "my name is Grace Williams and I work as a community social worker. I'm not here in any official capacity, and I know it's unusual for me to address the court like this, but I couldn't sit quietly while this young man faces these charges without someone speaking up for who he really is." Judge Carter nodded for her to continue, and Grace took a deep breath before going on. 8 months ago, I found Devon sleeping in an abandoned warehouse. He was cold, hungry, and had given up hope that his life could get better. But instead of just another troubled kid looking for handouts, I discovered someone with tremendous potential who had simply lost his way after experiencing a devastating loss. As Grace spoke, Devon felt his throat tighten with emotion. He remembered that first night when she had shared her soup with him without asking for anything in return. At the time, he had been suspicious of her motives, but Grace had proven over and over again that she genuinely cared about helping him build a better life. Since that night, Grace continued, I've watched Devon work harder than most adults I know to turn his life around. He's held down 3 different part-time jobs, never missing a day of work even when he was sick. He enrolled in a program to earn his high school equivalency and has maintained perfect attendance despite having to take 2 buses to get there after working all day. Patricia's eyes widened as she listened to these details about her son's life. She had no idea Devon was working or going to school. For months, she had assumed he was spending his time getting into trouble with his friends. The realization that he had been trying to improve his life while she remained completely unaware made her feel like a failure as a mother. Grace pulled a folder from her purse and held it up slightly. I have letters of recommendation from Devon's employers, his teachers and community members he's helped. But more than that, I've seen his character when no one else was watching. I've seen him give his lunch money to a homeless veteran. I've watched him spend his Saturday mornings reading to children at the library. I've seen him cry when talking about his father and how much he misses having that guidance in his life. The courtroom remained completely silent as Grace's words sank in. Even the court reporter seemed to be holding her breath, not wanting to disturb the moment with the clicking of her keyboard. Judge Carter found herself genuinely moved by this testimony, which was rare after years of hearing every excuse and sob story imaginable. Devon struggled to keep his composure as Grace continued. Hearing someone speak about him with such respect and belief in his potential was overwhelming. For so long, the only voices he heard were either disappointed like his mother's or encouraging him toward trouble like his former friends. Grace was the first person in years to see something good in him and to believe he was worth saving. "I'm not here to make excuses for the choices that brought Devon to this courtroom today," Grace said, her voice gaining strength. "What he did was wrong, and he knows that. But I am here to tell you that this single moment of poor judgment does not define who he is or who he can become. In 8 months of working with Devon, I've seen more growth and determination than I witness in many people over several years." Grace paused and looked directly at Devon, her eyes filled with both love and disappointment. It was the look of someone who had invested deeply in another person's success and now had to watch them face the consequences of their mistakes. Devon met her gaze and felt his heart break a little, knowing he had let down the one person who truly believed in him. "Your Honor," Grace continued, turning back to the judge, "I understand that Devon needs to be held accountable for his actions, but I also believe that sending him to jail would destroy all the progress he's made and eliminate any chance he has of continuing on the positive path we've worked so hard to establish." The emotion in Grace's voice was unmistakable now, and several people in the courtroom found themselves wiping away tears. This wasn't just a social worker doing her job. This was someone who genuinely loved and cared about the young man sitting at the defendant's table. At that moment, something inside Devon broke open. All the pain and anger he had been carrying since his father's death, all the frustration and disappointment he had caused his mother, all the gratitude and love he felt for Grace's unwavering support, it all came rushing to the surface at once. Devon stood up abruptly, causing his chair to scrape loudly against the floor. The bailiff took a step forward, unsure whether this was some kind of outburst that needed to be controlled. But Devon wasn't acting out in anger or defiance. Instead, tears were streaming down his face as he looked at Grace with an expression of pure anguish. "Your Honor," Devon said, his voice cracking with emotion, "this woman has been more of a mother to me than anyone has been in years. When I was ready to give up on everything, when I thought nobody cared whether I lived or died, she showed up and proved me wrong." The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as Devon struggled to find the right words. Patricia felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. Hearing her son say that another woman had been more of a mother to him was devastating, but she also couldn't deny the truth in his words. Over the past few years, she had become so focused on Devon's problems that she had forgotten how to show him love and support. Devon turned to face Grace directly, and what happened next would be talked about in that courthouse for years to come. With tears still flowing down his cheeks, he looked at this woman who had never given up on him and said the words that changed everything. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm so sorry I let you down again." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia gasped audibly from the gallery. The bailiff froze in place, unsure how to respond to such an unprecedented moment. Judge Carter removed her glasses and stared at the scene unfolding before her, realizing she was witnessing something extraordinary. Grace stood perfectly still, tears now flowing freely down her own cheeks. In that single word, "Mom," she heard everything Devon had never been able to express. She heard his gratitude for her patience, his love for her unwavering support, and his recognition that she had filled a role in his life that no one else could fill. The moment stretched on, with everyone in the courtroom trying to process what they had just witnessed. This wasn't just a defendant and a character witness. This was a family that had formed not through blood or law, but through love, commitment, and the simple act of one person refusing to give up on another. The silence in the courtroom stretched for what felt like forever. Judge Carter sat motionless behind her bench, her glasses in her hand, staring at Devon and Grace with an expression that no one could quite read. In 30 years of practicing law and 12 years as a judge, she had seen thousands of cases, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The bailiff, a veteran officer named Tom who had worked in courtrooms for over 20 years, found himself completely unsure of what to do. His job was to maintain order, but what was happening before him wasn't disorder in any traditional sense. It was raw human emotion breaking through the formal barriers of the legal system, and he had no protocol for handling it. Patricia sat frozen in the gallery, her hands gripping her purse so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The word mom echoed in her mind over and over again. Her son had just called another woman mom in front of a room full of strangers, and the pain of that moment cut deeper than anything she had ever experienced. But underneath the hurt, she felt something else. A tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, Devon could still be saved. Grace stood perfectly still, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the young man she had come to love like her own child. When she had first found Devon in that abandoned warehouse 8 months ago, she never imagined their relationship would lead to this moment. She had simply seen a kid who needed help and offered what she could. But somewhere along the way, Devon had become the son she never had, and apparently she had become the mother he desperately needed. Mike Rodriguez, Devon's public defender, felt completely out of his depth. In law school, they had taught him about evidence and procedure, but nobody had prepared him for moments like this. He looked at his notes, then at his client, then back at his notes, realizing that everything he had planned to say seemed completely irrelevant now. Devon remained standing, his shoulders shaking as he tried to control his emotions. Calling Grace mom had been completely spontaneous, but the moment the word left his mouth, he knew it was the most honest thing he had said in years. This woman had shown him unconditional love when everyone else had given up on him. She had seen potential in him when he couldn't see it in himself. If that wasn't what a mother did, then he didn't know what was. Judge Carter slowly put her glasses back on and looked around the courtroom. Every face was turned toward her, waiting to see how she would respond to this unprecedented situation. She had always prided herself on running an orderly courtroom, but this moment was testing every rule and tradition she had ever known. Finally, Judge Carter did something that shocked everyone present. She stood up. In 12 years on the bench, Judge Carter had never stood up during proceedings except for very formal occasions. Judges stayed seated behind their elevated benches as a symbol of their authority and the dignity of the court. But this moment demanded something different, something more human than what the formal structure of the courtroom could provide. "Ma'am," Judge Carter said, looking directly at Grace, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "Would you please approach the bench?" Grace looked uncertain for a moment, glancing at the bailiff to see if this was really allowed. Tom nodded slightly, still not entirely sure what was happening, but trusting the judge's instincts. Grace walked slowly toward the bench, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. As Grace approached, Judge Carter stepped down from behind her bench, something that had never happened in Courtroom 3B during regular proceedings. The judge walked around to the front, putting herself on the same level as Grace, Devon, and everyone else in the room. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. The most powerful person in the room was literally lowering herself to stand among them as equals. "Ma'am," Judge Carter said again, her voice softer now but still audible to everyone. "In 30 years of legal practice, I have seen countless cases involving families torn apart by tragedy, addiction, poverty, and poor choices. I have watched parents give up on their children and children give up on their parents. I have seen more broken relationships than I care to count." Patricia felt each word like a physical blow, recognizing herself in the judge's description of parents who had given up. She wanted to stand up and defend herself, to explain all the efforts she had made and all the heartbreak she had endured. But deep down, she knew that somewhere along the way, she had stopped fighting for her son and started protecting herself from the pain of his failures. Judge Carter continued, her eyes moving between Grace and Devon. "But what I have just witnessed is something entirely different. I have seen genuine love in action, love that doesn't depend on blood relation or legal obligation, but on the simple human choice to care for another person without expecting anything in return." The judge paused and looked directly at Devon, who was still standing with tears on his cheeks. "Young man, when you called this woman mom, you weren't being disrespectful to your biological mother. You were recognizing someone who has truly been mothering you, feeding you when you were hungry, sheltering you when you were homeless, believing in you when you had lost faith in yourself, and loving you when you felt unlovable." Devon nodded, unable to speak but grateful that someone understood what he had meant. He glanced back at Patricia and saw her crying quietly, and for the first time in months, he felt sorry for hurting her, instead of just angry at her for not understanding him. Judge Carter turned back to Grace, and what she said next left everyone in the courtroom speechless. "Ma'am, I don't know your full story or what led you to that warehouse where you found Devon, but I want you to know that what you have done represents the very best of what human beings are capable of. You saw a child in need, and you responded with love, patience, and commitment. You became family to someone who desperately needed family." Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, overwhelmed by the judge's words. She had never thought of herself as doing anything extraordinary. She had simply seen a kid who needed help and offered what she could. The idea that her actions were being praised in such a public way felt both humbling and surreal. The judge then addressed the entire courtroom, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "Everyone in this room today has witnessed something remarkable. We have seen what happens when someone refuses to give up on another human being. We have seen how love and commitment can begin to heal even the deepest wounds, and how families can be formed through choice rather than just circumstance." Patricia felt the judge's words cutting through her defenses and reaching the part of her heart that still remembered how much she loved her son. She realized that her anger and disappointment had gradually replaced her love and support, and that Devon had found elsewhere what she had stopped providing at home. Judge Carter looked around the room once more, making eye contact with the court, reporter, the bailiff, the attorneys, and the few other people in the gallery. "What we decide here today will impact not just Devon's future, but the future of this relationship that has clearly been life-changing for both of them. This court has a responsibility not just to punish wrongdoing, but to recognize and protect the forces for good in our community." The judge walked back toward her bench but didn't sit down. Instead, she stood behind it with her hands resting on the wooden surface, looking down at Devon and Grace with an expression of deep thoughtfulness. "The law gives me several options for how to handle this case, but the law also gives me discretion to consider the unique circumstances involved. What I'm about to propose has never been done in my courtroom before, but then again, I've never seen anything like what I've witnessed here today." Everyone in the courtroom leaned forward slightly, sensing that whatever Judge Carter was about to say would be extraordinary. Devon looked at Grace, then at his mother, then back at the judge, knowing that his entire future hung in the balance of whatever decision was coming next. Judge Carter remained standing behind her bench, her hands resting on the polished wood as she gathered her thoughts. The entire courtroom seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a decision that everyone sensed would be unlike anything they had ever heard before. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keys as she waited to see what would happen next. "Devon," the judge said finally, her voice carrying the weight of years of experience and wisdom. "Please stand and face me." Devon slowly rose from his chair, his legs feeling shaky beneath him. He had been in this courtroom 3 times before, and each time the judge had delivered a punishment that felt routine and impersonal. But this time was different. This time, Judge Carter was looking at him, not as just another case number, but as a human being with a story worth understanding. "Before I announce my decision," Judge Carter continued, "I want to make sure you understand the gravity of the situation. You are here because you made choices that harmed others and broke the law. The fact that you have people who love you and believe in you doesn't erase those actions or their consequences. Do you understand that?" Devon nodded, his voice barely audible as he replied, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge studied his face for a moment, looking for signs of genuine remorse rather than just fear of punishment. What she saw was a young man who seemed to finally understand the weight of his actions and their impact on the people who cared about him. "Good," Judge Carter said. "Now, the law gives me several options for how to handle your case. I could sentence you to 90 days in county jail, which is what your record would typically warrant. I could order extensive community service and probation. Or I could try something that has never been done in this courtroom before." Patricia gripped the edge of the wooden bench in front of her, her heart racing as she waited to hear what the judge had in mind. Part of her was terrified that Devon would be sent to jail, but another part of her wondered if that might finally be the wake-up call he needed. She felt torn between wanting to protect her son and wanting him to face real consequences for his Actions. Grace stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the judge's face, trying to read what was coming next. She had prepared herself for the possibility that Devon might be sent to jail, and she had already started thinking about how she could support him through that experience. But something in the judge's tone suggested that wasn't the direction this was heading. "Devon," Judge Carter said, "I'm going to offer you a choice. You can accept the standard sentence of 90 days in county jail, followed by 1 year of probation, or you can commit to something much more challenging and potentially life-changing." The judge paused, allowing the weight of those words to sink in before continuing. "If you choose the alternative, you will enter into a formal mentorship program under Grace's supervision. This isn't just a slap on the wrist or an easy way out. It will require you to meet strict conditions for an entire year, with monthly check-ins in this very courtroom." Devon's eyes widened as he began to understand what the judge was proposing. This wasn't just about avoiding jail time. It was about committing to the kind of structured support that could actually help him build a better life. Judge Carter outlined the conditions in detail. You will maintain steady employment or enrollment in educational programs. You will complete 200 hours of community service, but not just picking up trash on the highway. You will work with programs that help other young people who are struggling, so you can understand the impact of your choices and hopefully prevent others from making similar mistakes. The judge looked directly at Grace as she continued. "Ms. Williams, this would be an enormous responsibility. You would essentially be taking legal guardianship of a young adult who has a history of poor decision-making. You would be accountable to this court for his progress and setbacks. Are you prepared for that level of commitment?" Grace didn't hesitate for even a second. "Yes, Your Honor. I've been preparing for exactly this kind of responsibility for the past 8 months. Devon has shown me that he's capable of change when he has the right support system. I believe in him, and I'm willing to put my reputation and career on the line to prove it." The judge then turned to Patricia, acknowledging her presence for the first time since the proceedings began. "Mrs. Thompson, I realize this is an unusual situation, and I can only imagine how difficult it must be to hear your son call another woman mom. But I want you to know that there is absolutely a place for you in this arrangement if you're willing to be part of the solution." Patricia felt tears welling up in her eyes as the judge continued. "Your son needs all the support he can get, and that includes the love of his biological mother. But that support needs to come without conditions or expectations of immediate gratitude. It needs to come from a place of love rather than disappointment." The judge's words hit Patricia like a physical blow, but they also offered her something she hadn't felt in years: hope. For the first time, someone was telling her that it wasn't too late to rebuild her relationship with Devon, but that it would require her to change her approach completely. "Devon," Judge Carter said, returning her attention to the young man who would have to make this choice. "If you accept this alternative sentence, you will have 2 mothers watching over you, supporting you, and holding you accountable. That's more than most people get in this life, but it also means you'll have no excuses if you mess up again." Devon looked at Grace, then back at his biological mother, seeing something in Patricia's eyes that he hadn't seen in years. Not disappointment or anger, but love mixed with hope. For the first time since his father died, he felt like maybe his family could be whole again, even if it looked different than it used to. "I accept the alternative sentence, Your Honor," Devon said, his voice stronger now than it had been all day. Judge Carter smiled for the first time during the proceedings. "Very well, but understand this, Devon. If you violate any of the conditions of this arrangement, you will serve the original jail sentence plus additional time for failing to honor this opportunity. This court is giving you a chance that most people never get. Don't waste it." Over the following month, something remarkable happened. Devon threw himself into the program with an energy and commitment that surprised everyone, including himself. He worked full-time at a local automotive shop, where his boss praised his reliability and eagerness to learn. In the evenings, he attended classes and was on track to earn his high school equivalency ahead of schedule. But the most significant change was in his relationships. Grace became his official mentor, meeting with him twice a week to check on his progress and help him work through challenges. She taught him practical skills like budgeting and time management, but more importantly, she helped him process his grief over his father's death in healthy ways. Patricia, meanwhile, began attending family counseling sessions with Devon and Grace. It was awkward and painful at first, with years of hurt feelings and misunderstandings to work through, but gradually, Patricia learned to listen without judgment and to offer support without trying to control every aspect of Devon's life. The breakthrough came 4 months into the program, when Devon had a particularly difficult day at work and called both women for support. Instead of competing for his attention, Grace and Patricia worked together to help him through the crisis. That night, Patricia texted Grace to thank her for everything she had done for Devon, and Grace invited Patricia to have coffee the next day to talk. 6 months after that day in court, Devon stood in the same courtroom for his progress review. This time, both Grace and Patricia sat together in the front row, having formed an unlikely friendship built around their shared love for Devon. When Judge Carter asked about his progress, Devon was able to report that he had completed his equivalency program with honors, maintained perfect attendance at work, and finished half of his required community service hours. But more importantly, he had learned to talk about his father without anger, to appreciate his mother without resentment, and to accept Grace's love without feeling guilty about it. He had discovered that families could grow rather than just break, and that love multiplied rather than divided when people opened their hearts to possibilities they had never imagined. As the hearing concluded, Judge Carter made one final observation that would be remembered long after that day. "Mr. Thompson, when you first appeared in my courtroom, you were a young man who had lost his way after losing his father. Today, you stand before me as someone who has gained not just direction, but also a family that chose to love you back to wholeness. That transformation didn't happen because of any sentence I could have imposed, but because people chose to believe in you when you couldn't believe in yourself." Devon left the courthouse that day with Grace on one side and Patricia on the other, finally understanding that love wasn't something you had to choose between, but something you could choose to multiply. He had learned that calling Grace Mom didn't take anything away from Patricia, just as accepting Patricia's love didn't diminish what Grace meant to him. He had found his way back to family, even if that family looked nothing like what he had expected it to be.